I'm sure all of us have experienced that feeling when you're on a long drive, you're hungry, and you stop at some roadside eatery to grab a bite. And then you're a little bit anxious, wondering if the food here is clean and safe. But as soon as you hear this story, you probably won't dare to eat fast food by the roadside anymore. Maybe even give up fast food entirely. Many killers can evade justice for a while because of their perfectly normal appearance. No suspicious signs. But with Joe Metheny, just by looking at him, you'll realize that this is the embodiment of evil. And once people hear his story, they'll have no more doubts. Joe Metheny was born on May 2nd, 1953, in Maryland, into a large family with 6 children. His father was a heavy alcoholic, and his mother was rarely home due to heroin addiction. To be frank, his family was nothing short of a hellish version of the Brady Bunch. When Joe was 6 years old, his father died in a car accident. According to his own account, throughout his childhood, he was constantly moved from one orphanage to another. At 18, Metheny joined the army. It was during this time that he started getting involved with heroin and cocaine. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? His mother once said that Joe served in Germany in 1973, but he himself claimed to have fought in Vietnam. After being discharged, Joe cut off contact with his family and began living a nomadic life. Homelessness plunged him deeper into addiction, and everything spiraled out of control. Joe was also nicknamed Tiny in a teasing way because he was a very tall and muscular man, standing at 1.85 meters. He often roamed bars and lived with other homeless people in makeshift camps in South Baltimore. All the money he earned from driving a forklift was spent on drugs and alcohol. Yet somehow, in the early 1990s, Metheny built a seemingly stable life. He worked as a truck driver, got married, had children, and even bought a trailer for his family to live in. But as they say, history repeats itself, and in Metheny's case, that was entirely true. His wife gradually also fell into addiction, and one day, when he returned home, Joe found the house empty. His wife, children, and belongings had all vanished without a trace. According to his later confession, his wife had met another man, then left with him, taking their children to start a new life. Soon after, Joe heard rumors that the other man had no good intentions. His wife, due to addiction, had become a prostitute to support both their habits. Eventually, they lost custody of their children and had to live under a bridge with other homeless people. Hearing this drove Joe insane, and so he decided to set out to find his ex-wife. It's unclear whether his intention was revenge or rescue, but after hearing what he did during that journey, you certainly won't find an ounce of goodness in him. After finding out where his wife often went to do drugs, an abandoned bridge, Joe immediately went there. But as soon as he arrived, he didn't find his wife, only dirty mattresses, and a horrific scene where his wife had certainly slept. In a fit of rage, he did drugs with 2 other homeless men, Randy and Randall Brewer, then brutally murdered both of them. According to his later confession, he dismembered them. Then, Joe approached a woman he knew who was acquainted with his wife. He gave her drugs to try and extract information, but she refused to reveal anything. In a fit of anger, he sexually assaulted her and strangled her to death, then dumped her body in a bush. Not stopping there, he lured another woman, and the result was exactly the same as the previous one. While disposing of the second victim's body, he discovered a man fishing nearby. Fearing exposure, Joe approached and struck the man hard on the head with an iron pipe, killing him instantly. Then he buried the heads of the two homeless men, tied bricks to the bodies of the girl and the fisherman, and then threw both into the river. The first victim's body he kept in the bush. Even for seasoned criminals, the number of victims in Joe's first spree was chilling. In an interrogation, Joe Metheny calmly said, "It was a very busy night. 5 lives in just 7 hours. Some people just dip their toes into a life of crime to satisfy their urges. But with Joe Metheny, he plunged headfirst into that muddy pit." Another haunting detail revealed in Joe Metheny's later confessions. After murdering a woman named Catherine, he severed her head from her body and buried it in a different location, not with the rest of her body. 6 months later, Metheny returned to the burial site. He dug up the decomposed head, cleaned off the maggots, and then did something unimaginable. It was clear that in Metheny's eyes, these victims were not human. Perhaps he viewed these addicted women as if they were inferior beings, undeserving of life, people he could easily dispose of without a shred of remorse. 2 weeks after the murders, Metheny was arrested in connection with the deaths of Randy and Randall Brewer. He was imprisoned for 18 months, but eventually released because the police lacked sufficient physical evidence to convict him. One of the worst decisions in Baltimore's judicial history, and this is when things became extremely horrifying. After being released, Metheny no longer had an interest in finding his ex-wife, but turned to finding pleasure by ending other people's lives. Not only that, he also found a way to make money from the bodies of his victims. People might ask how killing others could make money. It turns out that with a few herbs and the right cooking method, human flesh could be turned into a dish even more appealing than a Big Mac. Dehumanizing his victims was consistent in Metheny's behavior, and he took it to a new level in the next phase of his life, a phase that, if the Ministry of Health knew about, would immediately declare a public health emergency. After being released from prison, Joe Metheny began selling food by the roadside. He set up a small barbecue stand near the area where he used to live. There, he served hamburgers, which, according to his own confession, were mixed with human flesh. He laughed triumphantly as he recounted how customers ate human flesh without knowing, even praising it as delicious. Joe said that if you mix human flesh with pork or beef and then season it properly, people can hardly tell the difference. For him, it was no longer just a hobby, but also a business. After getting out of prison, Joe Metheny was free to carry out the sick fantasies he had harbored during his incarceration. He returned to Pallet Company, where he used to work as a forklift driver, and begged his boss for a job. Not only that, he also convinced his boss to let him stay in a trailer on the company grounds, with the excuse of providing night security. So, the boss agreed. Metheny lived alone in a secluded area at the end of a cul-de-sac, an ideal location for a serial killer to operate. Here, Metheny lured 2 girls to his home with a familiar trick, offering them drugs. After sexually assaulting them, he murdered the 2 girls and then dismembered them. Part of their bodies he stored in plastic containers and put in the freezer for later use. The rest he buried in shallow graves near his home. After tasting human flesh, Metheny came up with a crazy business idea. opening a roadside barbecue stand, something that should have been shut down very early on for false advertising, because the meat in his burgers came from the very girls he had murdered. He calmly stated that because human flesh tasted very similar to pork, it was easy to mix it into burgers. He ran this eatery for several weeks until his special meat ran out. And because he needed to replenish his ingredients, Metheny acted again. He lured a 23-year-old girl named Kimberly Lynn Spicer, then murdered her and hid her body on the pallet company premises on December 8th, 1996. A few days later, he invited another friend named Rita Camper to do drugs with him. When Rita refused to have sex, Joe started to go wild. He ripped off her clothes and started laughing maniacally while she screamed. He told her he would finish her off and bury her like the other girls. But luckily, this time he made a mistake. Rita broke free, ran through the lumber yard, climbed over a stack of pallets, and jumped over a barbed wire fence. A bitter irony at this moment was that his own massive body, 1.85 meters tall and weighing 200 kilograms, which had easily helped him subdue victims while high, now made him slow and unable to keep up with Rita. Metheny could only silently watch a pickup truck pick up Rita and then speed into the night. Terrified, he picked up her clothes and threw them outside the gate. Then he called a friend, asking if he could help him bury Kimberly Bell, whose body was still in the pallet company yard. But that very call was the end for the devil. On December 13th, police stormed in and arrested Joe Metheny. On the very day his friend called the authorities about the terrifying offer of help. That was also the end of Metheny's reign of terror, and perhaps the beginning of a statewide burger boycott campaign. The owner of Pallet Company was also convicted as an accomplice for helping Metheny conceal evidence to protect his friend and business. When interviewed, Metheny confessed that he had killed 10 people. His lawyer tried to dismiss the confession, saying that long-term drug use had caused him to have delusions and misremember events. In one instance, when recounting his crimes, he coldly said, "It sounds like this is just a revenge story of a betrayed man." But in reality, what made Metheny most ecstatic was the feeling of ending someone's life and the feeling of making others eat their own bodies. When he was sentenced, Joe asked the court to sentence him to death and added, "More than," when asked why he did such cruel things. He simply replied that he liked it. In the case involving Rita Camper, he was sentenced to 50 years in prison for kidnapping and attempted murder. In 1998, he got his wish when he was sentenced to death. Then he pleaded guilty to robbing Catherine. The prosecution also pushed for the death penalty in this case to ensure Metheny would be sent to the electric chair. But things did not go as expected. By 2000, the death penalty was overturned, and he was commuted to life imprisonment without parole. This was one of many serious errors in the investigation and trial process, but many people believe that not executing Metheny was the biggest mistake. In 2017, Joe Metheny was found dead in prison in Maryland, aged 62. But everyone understood that a life of addiction and severe obesity played a very large part in that death. I have told many scary and horrific cases, but Joe Metheny is definitely one of the demons among them. In the original video, people also advised to be careful when buying snacks by the roadside, but I think such horrific things, luckily, I have never heard of happening in Vietnam, or have they already?